So, recently, I've spent a lot of time thinking back on things. That was true at the time of writing this, and it's still true now at time of recording. A lot of it was spurred on by my second child reaching the age of 5. She's 6 now. For those who don't know, this is the age I was when I was involved in an accident that left me with a permanent scar on my right wrist. Though, thankfully, that hasn't been constantly playing on my mind in itself. It's more that I've been remembering where I was at younger ages, the place I've lived, which have been many, the various domiciles I formed many of my memories around, and how moving so often as a child may have affected the person I have ultimately become. May have. See, we're in the process of looking for a new home right now. Not something we intend to do in the immediate future, as evidenced by the fact that it's been like a year since I started writing this, because our finances are already earmarked for more important things, but it's something that has me musing, wondering what, if any, effect it will have on my child. In her case, it will probably be exciting, assuming it is just the once, which I have every intention to ensure it is, at least for some years to come. I don't want her being passed around from pillar to post. She needs a far greater sense of stability than I had. Which also has me in an interesting position because I've lived here for more than 10 years now. Almost 15 years. More than a quarter of my life. It's a lot to take in, you know? In a particularly apt moment of synchronicity, just a few days ago at time of writing, I was talking to a lady at the local newsagents. The specifics of the subject are immaterial, however, she was commenting on a certain business that no longer operated in the area, at least not at the same location. And it got me thinking. I was already leaning heavily towards writing this script, even before it came up on my Twitter poll. Yeah, I did a poll about this. It's the one I really wanted to write. I've just been making more of an effort to engage with community. What was that about being apt again? Anyway, it got me to thinking about how much things have changed since I moved in here 15-ish years ago. The businesses that have come and gone, the people, remodeling to those that have remained, all that good stuff. I know that can be something that makes people feel like they no longer belong, a constant reminder that the world moves on around you, no matter how much you may rail against it. But it's never been that way for me. Of course, it's sad to see things go, like the lovely couple who used to run the chippy next door. I think I will always remember them offering to boil water for me so I could have a cup of tea when I first moved in. Like, literally within the first couple of days, maybe 3, our boiler wasn't working. I mentioned that, and they said if I ever needed a cup of tea, they could boil water. I was like, thanks, I have a kettle. That's not the problem, but, it stuck with me. Because our boiler was on the fritz, we couldn't run the radiators or get hot water from the tap. I really should read these ahead before I start going off script. And me simply mentioning that in passing at our first meeting was enough for them to step up and do the neighbourly thing. It was our first, or at most second, conversation. The wife from next door specifically inquiring after us because she hadn't seen us before and knew that we most likely had taken up the flat apartment next door. It was sad to see them go almost a decade later when they decided it was time to move on and live a less demanding life. They were an older couple, older than my answer to the great question of life, the universe and everything age at time of writing. I'm running a small, successful, but small takeaway. Just felt like too much effort for them. So, without further ado, out they pieced.
Yeah, okay, no. Dave, I'm going to pretend that I have a lunch to go to.
There were several reasons my musings trended in this direction. Around a year ago, maybe a year and a half, I found myself back in the area I grew up. Though my family, and later I solely, moved several times in my younger years, I effectively spent half of my life, a full 2 decades, in the same small section of North Manchester. We didn't spend any real time there, merely passing through on a bus. But as we did, I just spent some time musing on old memories, pointing out some of my childhood landmarks to my wife, telling her a little about the things I got up to as a teenager, where I'd go, who I was with, that kind of thing. A couple of years before that, we were back in the area I lived immediately after moving out from there, fully on my own. My first personal home. I lived there for the better part of a decade, and on this occasion we did linger for a while, exploring a little. Enough that I was able to show her exactly where my first home actually is, and how little it's really changed since I left. Still the same now as far as I'm aware. It was a surprisingly uplifting experience. Despite some bad memories associated with my time there, most notably being how I had to leave. It was not by choice, but it was really nice to go back and just see. And then there was the conversation mentioned above, back at the beginning. It just nailed it all down for me, making me think about the Yakuza series and how it has changed, like a dragon as is now known, with specific regard to the primary location that the series frequents, Kamurocho, a small section of Tokyo based heavily, in fact almost directly, on the Kabukicho red light district. It's known for its nightlife, including what the Japanese call soaplans. For those who don't know, their equivalent of, shall we say, exotic massage parlours. You know exactly what I mean. I've never been to Japan, never mind Tokyo, so I can't directly comment on precisely how accurate it is to the real world. But I do know that a number of the businesses you can visit are in fact actual real places. From what I understand, several of them were included in the first game as a way of generating extra revenue to help develop the game. I believe several of them contributed financially to RGG, like American companies used to back in the day when featuring their product in a film was considered good advertising rather than a privilege you had to pay them for. So I expect it's pretty accurate, if not directly one-to-one. Some of the stuff is definitely not real, even if the buildings are, but still, pretty close, I'm told. After playing so many of them, there are more than a dozen by this point, I consider myself to be quite familiar with most of the maps, Kamurocho in particular, since it's been in pretty much all of them and it's fairly small. I keep forgetting the names of the streets, or more accurately, which streets have which names, barring a few, but there are certain landmarks that I just accept as a given, with a couple of them being places I beeline for right at the beginning of each game to stock up on a few key items. So when I went moseying on down Nakamichi, I immediately spotted something was different.
This is awkward.
I was actually playing Yakuza 7 when I first saw it, but you get my point. This one's Lost Judgment for those who don't know. It was jarring, to say the least, though far from the first time something looked completely different. What made this stand out so much was that it didn't have any prior precedent. Even though I played Judgment before Song of Life, seeing the desolation of Little Asia didn't stand out in the same way. It was a surprise, for sure, but Little Asia has been shown changing over the course of the games anyway, so I could easily pass that it was just something new that would either come up later in the game or, as is the case, something from an earlier one, Song of Life. Every entry in the franchise has things that are different from those which came before. Some of them are a bit weird, like deciding to change the direction of the stairs, but mostly it just reflects the way neighbourhoods change. Where I'm living now, it's been 15 years, as I've said repeatedly, and I've seen multiple businesses come and go. There's one that's changed just recently, with new ones opening all the time. There's one that's might even be closing down. There's an entirely new building that's come to fruition only a few years hence, and there's another one being built right now, finally, that was like an open, empty lot with just a big hole for years. This is a feeling that few, if any, game franchises have managed to convey in the same way as Like a Dragon. Each new entry feels like coming home. I remember when Saints Row 3, I'm pretty sure, was heading towards release, there were some voices raised in criticism of the fact that it was going to be in the same city, set again in Steelport, I think it was. Which is crazy when you think about it, because it's an entire city, more or less. It should be difficult for something of that scale to grow tiresome. And they found some pretty creative ways of making the next two games not feel as repetitive, in my opinion. But it still struck me as odd, especially as the years went by and I finally jumped into Like a Dragon, because it's something I've seen is never a complaint levied against them. And I think I know why, but I want to elucidate on this a little bit further, because I've been thinking on this. The thing about Saints Row 3 is it was in a different city. It was in Stillwater, wasn't it? Or was the originally Stillwater? It was either Stillwater or Steelport, whichever. And there might not have been many people, but there was one person in particular I remember complaining about it, and looking back on it, I don't know why, because it is a different city. Anyway, Stillwater is the new one, I guess. See, Stillwater is a big city. That's what's written here. Well, it's not. Really, it's probably not much larger than the village I live in. A village inside a city. Because the UK is crazy, but whatever. I grew up in a village as well. In a city. Anyway, the scale of it, as mentioned too often already, yay for vigoration, should engender a sense of, well, scale that can keep it interesting for many, many hours. Something this big should have so many little nooks and crannies and Easter eggs and shit it can keep your attention for literal months of in-game playtime. And yet, somehow it doesn't. Well, it does for some people, but it doesn't for a lot of people. And here's why I think that is.
Well, we're waiting.
Look at Camarocho again. It's fucking tiny. On foot, you can get across the entire thing in just a few minutes. Longer if you go at walking speed, but still measured in only minutes. It's not like hours of walking. In fact, it's so darn small that the school in Lost Judgment, a single building, well, compound, is actually larger by a noticeable amount. Seriously, that school is huge. And that did have complaints about it being boring, which is understandable. Just look at it. Even during the day, it's pretty barren, which isn't that surprising, if disappointing. I mean, it's a school. Unless you're there during class time, there's not going to be a lot to see. And even then, most of what's going on will be in the classrooms. But anyway. Meanwhile, Camarocho has all these little bits and doodads going on. There are pedestrians on the streets wandering around, getting into shenanigans like RCIAS, repetitive concussion-induced amnesia syndrome, from being punched in the face by Kiryu so many times. All talking amongst themselves. There are businesses everywhere, some you can enter and interact with, most that you can't. But you can see them, look at their logos, and even see details of the particulars of the services they offer. It can be engaging to just go to the car park and check out the new billboards, or spot this craziness. What the hell is this all about? What the hell happened to Wet Kitchen? Out of game, I know that Don Quixote is gone because the advertising agreement ended. That's why they have the police station there now. But Wet Kitchen isn't a real place. And the other ones are still there. So I don't know what's going on there. It was cool though. My point is that the map's scale works in its favour. All of them, across the franchise, even Ijincho, which is perhaps the largest, I'll come back to this, rivaled maybe by Yakuza 5's Camarocho with the underground and stuff. They're all tightly constrained in such a way that they feel homely, inviting, familiar. Each new game feels more like going back to your old stomping grounds, barring new areas of course, but each of those is also small enough that, whilst being unfamiliar at first, fairly quickly just become another place you feel at home in. Each new game bringing with it a sense of nostalgia not at all dissimilar to going back to an older game, because they are, quite literally, an extension of their forebears, more of the same, in a good way. Even the man who erased his name, which I didn't like very much, it doesn't go to Kamurocho, but it does go to Osaka. It goes to Sotenbari, which we're also familiar with. We've been there several times. Also, it's where Bejima comes from, so I'm biased as all hell. I'm going to come back to this in a future video, actually. But more of that, well, during that video. For now, let me lay the groundwork with some more broad-scale comparisons. You know how open world games are like super popular? Massive, sprawling maps promising hundreds and thousands of hours of exploration. There's so much to see, to find, to explore. And for a while it's quite engaging. There's just so much here. It can be quite compelling to wander away off the beaten path, ignoring the main story and just go off on a magical journey into the wilderness to see what one can see. And yet the stats speak for themselves. The average completion for a video game stands roughly, very roughly, at somewhere around 50%. As in, half of the people who begin playing a game will continue until they reach the end of the game, the end credits, the final mission, whatever. That's going to vary, of course. A game like the original Resident Evil takes only a few hours until you're shivving up the tyrant, but that's my point. Taking a quick look at the completion rate for traditional, if such they can be called, open world games, we see that percentage is just a tad lower, by about half. So half of half the players get to the end credits, or about 25 to 30%, even with people who've put in dozens, even hundreds of hours.
Search your feelings, you know it to be true.
At some point, the sheer volume of stuff starts to work against it. For a start, it's really difficult to make something big remain consistently interesting, or at the bare minimum, interesting enough to keep someone's attention. Kind of like a TV series. As they continue, year after year, viewing figures tend to drop off. They go back up, but they generally trend downwards, no matter how good the show is. Over time, people just, drift away. And it's actually easier to keep people involved with something that's released in chunks, because each episode is a small time investment. And especially now, easily digestible because you can engage at your own pace. We're no longer bound by the necessity for being at the TV at a specific time. That's something else I could talk about at a future date. But anywho, my point is, the longer something goes on for, the more difficult continued investment becomes. A large open world game is at increased risk of exposure fatigue because not only are they large in physical scale, they also tend to be lengthy in content. It's also only one thing. It doesn't have as much change going on because you don't get new cast members coming in and having their entire arcs and stuff. I mean, they kind of have to be from a sheer design perspective. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I can't really see many, if any, studios committing to spend all of the resources, monetary and manpower, into making such a large product without actually making use of it. There's no point in having all that extra space if you're not going to do anything with it. Just look at Ubisoft if you don't believe me. Look at how ridiculously overloaded with crap they are. Chests to find, towers to climb, whatever else. They're so terrified of the player losing interest. Well, I'm autistic. That's too much shit. It's overwhelming. Small scale maps have a distinct advantage even when the game is lengthy in narrative. I mean, the short Like a Dragon games are still typically more than 60 hours of stuff if you include all of the side content. And even the actual story part of the games, the main narratives, gives 20 plus. Apart from the man who erased his name, that was about 12. That was really short. You see what I mean? Most of them top 100 hours to do everything, and yet they tend to have a completion percentage closer to the industry average. And though it's a large factor, I can assure you it's not because of the writing quality. No shade, because they're very well written. Just that they're not well written enough to circumvent the time investment issue alone, because that's a lot of time to sink into a single game, especially one that's also single player. Because it's often the community aspect of multiplayer games that keeps those people coming back. Mini games and side content are a much stronger imperative, which might seem odd. When you're getting burned out on a game for any reason, then obviously you want to stop playing it, if only for a little while, right? I mean, maybe, sure, sometimes, but I don't know. Speaking from personal experience, I usually just want a change of pace, a little time to do something else. I expect most people are the same. It's not that you're not liking it anymore, or even that you aren't enjoying yourself in that moment. It's more like eating your favourite meal. Even if you're greatly enjoying the meal and fully intend to finish it, at some point, your stomach is full, or your throat hurts, and you just need a little time for it to pass into your intestines, or wash it down with a cold drink. You want to pause, not stop. And I, again, don't know about you, but I typically find that doing something else within the game soothes that sensation a lot faster and more effectively than stepping away completely. If you disagree or think that's a flat out impossibility, then I have only 2 words to say to you. Insert black and white Mr. Impossible meme here, because triple triad.
I understood that reference.
So, a lot's changed since I started writing this script. This is going to feel a bit out of left field because of that. My original intention was actually to spend a lot more time musing over in-game games, but the release of Infinite Wealth, I said I'd come back to that, went a long way towards proving the very point I've been making. Just take a look at this. After all this time I spent lauding RGG's world design, which isn't that long actually, it's going to be a very short video for me, this feels very out of place. I won't go so far as to say it ruins the game, and I can appreciate the intention, but Hawaii is just that little bit too large. It leaves us with a lot of wide, open streets that feel empty. Even some of the smaller areas still feel really big. I remember when I first began exploring Ijincho, which was previously the biggest, I think. Possibly still is. Pretty sure. I felt like it was going to be overwhelming. Prior to this game, I'm sure it was the largest area in the series. But because of the way it's constructed, how neatly separated everything is, it sidesteps the issue. Each individual section is more compact, making it feel more like a series of self-contained districts. Like a real city even. But Hawaii is just so open. Even the more densely packed areas can feel a bit barren at times. Side passages and back alleys that are just there, rather than offering interesting sights and experiences of their own. So I'm actually going to bring everything to a close now. I no longer feel the need to expound on this further. I think I've proven my point. You are, of course, entirely free to disagree. And I don't dislike Infinite Wealth, I actually really liked it. But I just think Hawaii is just a little bit too big. And open world games are popular for a reason. I've actually recently been playing Dragon's Dogma 2 and greatly enjoying my time with it. I'm loving the game, despite the size of the world. Or, perhaps, because it too has its world split into more clearly defined subsections. I suppose all I really want to say, TLDR, is that smaller maps are more intimate. Large ones are dull. Fight me. Comment, subscribe, all that stuff. I have a Patreon. Whatever legit YouTubers are supposed to say. That's all I have on this one. So, until next time, bit of a awkward ending, but thank you for watching.